I pointed out how the Japanese woke up from their cult, and it was a death cult to the point where Japanese bombers would fly their planes right onto the decks of American aircraft carriers, the infamous kamikaze pilots. It was a German death cult in that they would charge into battles that everybody was going to get wiped out. They didn't, nothing stopped them. There was, and then I talked about the death cult that is ISIS and how I think that there's really, at the level of psychology, some very, very consequential parallels between the Nazis and the Japanese in the 30s and 40s in particular, and ISIS today. But then I brought in Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. Now, there are many people who would say, hey, wait a minute, you're comparing Ted Cruz and Donald Trump's followers with the followers of Hitler and Tojo? Well, not exactly. What I am suggesting, though, is that we get these cults, these political / religious / death cults, and they're death cults in that they're almost always tied to the idea of an apocalypse. Jesse Ventura was with me in Russia, and we had a really interesting conversation. Actually, it was almost a debate between Jesse and one of the people who was on our group. He does a show on RT, and he was like, I'm a atheist because every major religion has, with the exception of Buddhism, has this end of the world scenario, this apocalyptic scenario. And if you believe that, then you're not reluctant to have a war because, hey, the world's going to end anyway. And you're not reluctant to destroy the planet because, hey, the world's going to end anyway. And he said, I think that that's a really, really bad thing. So anyhow, we've got these kind of death cults, and eventually something typically wakes people up out of them. And usually it's that the death cult has reached the point where it is so obvious that it is destructive that it has created a war or it's destroying its own people. And again, you see this thing with ISIL. We just heard from the president about that. And my guess is that if ISIL is going to be defeated, or the psychology, the cult, the death cult is going to be defeated, it's going to be defeated in two ways, or three ways, arguably. The way that we're trying to defeat it is militarily, like we did Germany and Japan. That is going to be the least successful of the three ways, although it may be a necessary part of it, particularly when we're protecting refugees, although there are those who would argue that we're creating refugees. I think that, Obama's responses to this point, in my personal opinion, I think have been rational and relatively measured. Even though I realize that some of the drone strikes, most of the drone strikes, which have killed more innocent people than bad guys, to use a colloquial phrase, have created more people who hate us. I get that. But number one, you've got, defeating them on the battlefield. But more importantly, they will be defeated, A, because the Muslims in the region realize that these people are nuts and don't want to have anything to do with their death cult. And many of them in these countries that were run by secular dictators like Libya and Iraq remember a time in their lifetime, I mean, literally in the last 10, 15, 20 years, easy, and in Libya and just in the last 5 years, they remember a time when you could go to college for free, when you had national health care. Yeah, they did in these countries. I mean, you could argue they were more, in terms of the quality of life of the average individual who was not a political activist. Obviously, that's the one exception. That life was pretty good. There were plenty of jobs. The government was the employer of last resort in both countries. But now ISIL comes in. I think I'm going to start calling them ISIL because the president does. ISIL comes in, and they start doing this death cult thing, and 30% tax on everybody to fund their operations and all business operations. Rob, rape, pillage, steal, et cetera, et cetera. And people are going, wait a minute, these people are friggin' nuts. So, that's the second way that they get defeated. And the third way they get defeated is if other Muslims in the region step up and come to the defense of the people who are the victims of ISIL. Now, that's happening to some extent with the Shia coming out of Iran. It's happening to some extent with the Kurds, but we're all waiting for the Sunnis. And, where are the Sunni fighters? When Iraq tried to put together a Sunni army, what did they do? They melted into nothing when first time ISIS yelled boo. And I think that problem goes back to Saudi Arabia and the fact that Saudi Arabia has been promoting Wahhabism or Salafism, this very, very, very conservative interpretation of Islam for decades, if not centuries, and or close to a century, and it's taken hold. For example, and this was a program that we saw, I think it was on BBC, it might have been CNN International, might have even been RT. We watched a little bit of TV when we were in Russia, as laying in bed, getting ready to either waking up or getting ready to go to sleep. And this woman reporter read from a Saudi printed version of the Quran, which was a Salafist Quran. This is sort of like, the Catholic and the Protestant Bibles are different. The Ten Commandments, for example, in the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible, they're different. Similarly, the Saudi version of the Quran and the non-Saudi, the non-Salafist, non-Wahhabist normal version of the Quran are different. And the example that she gave, she was reading it and she said, and the Quran says a woman shall be modestly covered Well, Paul says the same thing in, I believe it's Romans, it might be Thessalonians, but, where he says that a woman should have her head covered, she should be silent, she should be subservient to her husband. But Paul says in Christianity, this isn't even the 5,000-year-old Judaism, this is 2,000-year-old Christianity. Paul says women should be covered. So, and in the Quran, it says women should be covered. But in the Salafist version, in the Wahhabist version, in the Saudi version of this, in parentheses after the word covered, they have the words to the effect of, meaning that every part of her body is covered except for a slit where her eyes are visible. Now, that's not actually in the Quran. It's added in a parentheses to explain what the word covered means in the Saudi version of the Bible. And thus you get these women wearing burqas. And I mean, this goes way beyond just the hijab that is worn by sort of Orthodox or religious Muslims, as opposed to the Wahhabist Muslims who cover completely their face with just a slit for their eyes. The normal Quran does not have that. So, most Muslims have never seen that. Or if they've seen it as a result of Saudi evangelism. And so I think as the toxicity of this death cult is exposed, if we can avoid being the bad guys in the region, if we can avoid the stupidity of Bush, Cheney, and Wolfowitz and occupy an Arab country or a Muslim country, if we can avoid that kind of asinine stupidity and instead empower Muslims in the region who have a rational worldview and who view the Salafites and the ISIL as crazy people, then I think that they can wake up from their own trance. We certainly, it's not our job to make them wake up from the trance unless it becomes World War III, which is what happened with Germany and Japan. Ultimately, it became our job because, although, the Russians bore the brunt of the pain in Europe anyway, in the war in Europe. To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.